Right. Well, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Kay Stefanik, the Assistant Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. I want to welcome you all to our Spring 2026 seminar series, Status of Nutrient Reduction Strategies in Upper Mississippi River Basin States. This semester, we will have speakers from Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, and Indiana. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items. First, please type any questions into the chat box, and I will read them to the speaker at the end of the presentation. Second, this webinar will be recorded and posted to the INRC website. Now on to today's talk. Today's speaker is Dr. Joseph Bonnell. He is the Nutrient Reduction Strategy Coordinator in the Office of Agriculture and Water Quality at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He will be presenting on a stakeholder-centered approach to developing a new nutrient loss reduction strategy for Wisconsin. All right, with that, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Kay, and thanks, Matt, for the invite to talk to everybody. Great to have this opportunity to share with you what we're doing in Wisconsin. This is probably going to be a little different than a lot of the presentations you hear about what states are doing with their nutrient reduction strategies. I am not going to be talking about a lot of water quality data. I'm not going to be showing a lot of graphs. I'm really talking about how we are developing our new strategy in Wisconsin and what that looks like really very much from a social perspective. Hopefully that will still be of interest to most of you, but we'll get started. So we are developing a new nutrient loss reduction strategy, and I always emphasize the new because this is not really a revision of the existing strategy. So why is that? Why are we developing a new strategy and not revising our old one? So we do have a strategy that was published around 2013, which is around the same time that the other states and who are members of the hypoxia task force were producing their nutrient loss reduction strategies or nutrient reduction strategies. We use different terminologies. But the strengths of that original document that we're still using, they pulled together a lot of water quality data. They really did a good job of demonstrating the problem. Like we've got major loads of nitrogen and phosphorus, where that's happening and what the trends were over the years leading up to 2013. Did a really good job of cataloging the policies and programs that the various agencies in the state had to try to address nutrient loss. And it also identified priority watersheds. Where do we need to focus our attention? What that strategy did not really do, it did not create a shared strategic vision. So in all honesty, it really wasn't a strategic document. It was really more of a cataloging of where are we in terms of the water quality aspect and what are we doing currently in terms of our policies and programs, with the assumption that if we just keep doing what we're doing, things are going to get better. There wasn't really a major effort to reach out to stakeholders, and it was actually the strategy itself was really produced primarily by DNR with help from UW Extension. So we didn't even really engage the other agencies that much, other than to say, tell us what you're doing, give us your programs and policies, and we'll include that in the document. So as a result, because it wasn't a strategic document, it has not really been utilized other than, to say, well, here are our policies and programs. Here's what we know about trends in nitrogen and phosphorus loads coming out of Wisconsin. And big part of the reason that it's not being utilized is it just didn't create a shared pathway or a shared understanding of, okay, here's what we need to do differently from what we're doing today going forward in order to have a greater impact on nutrient loss in the future. So just not a particularly useful document. And typically when I would go out and about around the state and talk about nutrient loss reduction strategies, I will ask folks, are you aware that we have one? And generally, if they work for a local or state agency or federal agency, they know that we have one. But if I ask, when was the last time you opened it up to use it? Not a lot of hands go up. So we wanted to correct that with this new strategy. So what are we going to do differently? Well, first of all, we are planning on developing a strategic document, which means that we are going to narrow and focus our attention on where and how we want to try to address nutrient loss. So that means, the hardest part about strategic planning is not determining what you are going to do. It's deciding what you're not going to focus on. So that's a big part of developing a new strategic nutrient loss reduction strategy. We also created a structure to bring the agencies together to work collaboratively on this strategy. I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a few slides. We are emphasizing and focusing on agricultural sources for the new strategy. The existing strategy really kind of treated them all relatively equally to say, here's what we're doing on urban stormwater. Here's what we're doing about ag non-point. This one is very much going to be focused on agricultural sources. And, what I'm really focusing on today and emphasizing is that we are really going the next level in terms of stakeholder engagement and in the development of this strategy. So why are we focusing on agriculture? I probably don't really need to even say that. I think it's probably true for most of you who are tuning in on this in your states that agricultural land is probably your number one source of nutrients to surface water. And those of you who have a lot of groundwater for drinking water, probably true for groundwater as well. And why are we focusing on stakeholder engagement? Well, obviously, we think that we're going to get a better strategy, that it's going to actually be something that people are aware of, that they reference, and that is actually a guiding document that drives us forward in how we think about and how we do the work that we do together. We also recognize that agricultural land is private land, and so the agencies don't get to decide what happens on agricultural land, which practices get implemented for the most part. And so we're very reliant on the people who own and manage that land. We also recognize that successful strategy, therefore, because agricultural land is private land, we know that we must have support from agriculture in order for anything that comes out of the strategy to actually be implemented. So some of you may be familiar with this diagram. This is from the International Agency for Public Participation. This is their spectrum of public participation. On the left is kind of the lowest level. This is what we typically do in agencies in terms of engagement in policy work is we inform folks this is what we're going to do. In some cases, we consult and say, do you like this? What did you like about it? How could we change this to get your support? But what we're really trying to do with the way that we're developing this strategy is really move that bar towards, or the arrow towards the right-hand side and move it more towards a collaborative and empowering approach to engaging stakeholders so that they really feel ownership, they feel a part of this, they see themselves in the nutrient loss reduction strategy, and they feel excited about, yeah, we can do this and let's do this together. So let's put a little finer point on what's the difference between a stakeholder-centered approach, at least the way we're doing it, from a more traditional approach to the way that we approach policy development, particularly for us in Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. I won't speak for other agencies in our state or other states, but typically, this is a diagram that I created to help me visualize what is the social system that we are trying to work with. Typically, when we're thinking about nutrient loss reduction strategies, we begin with the ecosystem. We think about inputs, flow pathways, and what are the things that we can do to interrupt those flow pathways. So we're thinking very much in ecosystem terms. But I needed a diagram that would help me think about the social system and how it functions. If you look on the far right column, that's the practices that go on the ground. The farmers are the ones who decide which practices go on the ground for the most part, in consultation with their advisors. And then on the left-hand side of the diagram are the agencies and the private sector consultants who, through their policies and programs in the public sector, through contracts and services in the private sector, are trying to influence the farmer to get them to adopt or not adopt certain nutrient management practices. Okay? So this is our social structure, which influences what happens on the ecosystem, what ends up on the landscape. So in a traditional approach to strategic planning, we might start with looking at the agencies, our policies and programs, and we would look at what are the practices that are on the ground or need to be on the ground. We would be asking questions like, what are the practices that we need the farmers to adopt, and where do we want them to put those practices? How many acres of cover crops do we need in order to achieve our nutrient loss reduction goals? Where do we need those practices? What are the policies and programs that we have? What are the tools in our toolbox to get the farmers to adopt those practices? And then how do we maybe want to modify how we do those policies and programs? How do we want to focus our resources in order to get more practices on the ground and more farmers participating in programs? Okay, so that's kind of the traditional approach. And then once we've answered those questions, we might then go to the farmers and say, hey, how can we make sure that you get more of these practices on the ground? What do we need to do to get you involved? And we probably may not even really engage the private sector in that conversation or until much later. A stakeholder-centered approach, at least the way that we're approaching it, is we are starting with the farmers and their consultants, not only in the private sector, but primarily focusing on the farmers and their private sector folks that they rely on for information and resources and decision making. And we are asking the farmers, what's working for you to address nutrient loss on your farm? What are the practices that you are finding are working for you? And what do you see around you with other farmers? When you have conversations with them, what do you hear about what's working and what's not working? What are the barriers to getting more practices on the ground on your farm or, in the conversations you're having with other farmers? And what would be most helpful to getting more of that good work done and addressing the barriers to getting that good work done? So that's kind of a broad overview of our approach. And before I give you a little more detail about what that actually looked like for us, I want to provide a little bit of context to how our strategy is unfolding and what that looks like. So DNR is the state agency that's responsible for producing the nutrient loss reduction strategy in Wisconsin. But we knew fairly early on in the process of developing this new strategy that we were not going to go this alone. And so we convened a work group called our Interagency Water Quality Work Group, consisting of NRCS. The WLNW is Wisconsin Land and Water. That's Wisconsin's version of Soil and Water Conservation Association. So that's representing the counties, USGS, UW Extension, and a Department of Ag in Wisconsin. So we asked them to identify representatives to serve on the Interagency Water Quality Work Group. And then we also knew that we don't want to just consult with stakeholders or inform stakeholders about what we're doing, but we truly want to collaborate with them on the development and then obviously the implementation of the strategy. So a rough timeline here on the far left, the Office of Ag and Water Quality, which is where I am seated, was created in 2022. That's important because the Office of Ag and Water Quality within Wisconsin DNR was created in part to close the gap in trust between the agency and agriculture. So when we took on the development of this strategy, that was part of what we were trying to do it in a way that was going to help close the gap in trust between the agency and stakeholders. We got our Gulf hypoxia program funding in 2022 through EPA, provided funding to help support this effort to develop and implement a new strategy. I was hired with some of that funding from Gulf hypoxia in September of 23. We convened our interagency work group in January of 24 and started talking about, okay, how are we going to go about developing a new strategy? What are our broad objectives? What's going to be our process for engaging stakeholders? Because we knew early on this was going to be a high priority for us, as bringing stakeholders on board. I'll talk about our stakeholder roundtable that happened in December, and then we're giving ourselves a year to take what we got from our stakeholders and respond to that as agencies. But this, putting the stakeholder engagement just between April and December of last year is a little deceiving because, in fact, we're intending for that stakeholder engagement to continue throughout the process of both developing the strategy and then hopefully seamlessly move into implementation at the same time. So this wanted to just give you a quick view of the structure of our new strategy as it looks right now. On the left-hand side, or we're calling all these little boxes below the nutrient loss reduction strategy are components of our strategy. So on the left-hand side are the things that US EPA wants to see in a strategy. They want us to address stormwater and other non-ag, non-point sources. We are also going to talk about our point source strategies. This is a little artificial because it doesn't show a linkage between point sources and ag non-point, but there in Wisconsin, there is a very strong connection. We have nutrient trading and we have other mechanisms for point sources to be able to fund ag non-point practices. But, just thinking in terms of what's the document going to look like. And then we also need to address development of numeric criteria. And then the main piece of our strategy that I'm going to be focusing on today is our ag non-point strategy, and all these other elements or components really are informing the ag non-point strategy. So we're conducting a variety of science assessments that I can talk about later if you're interested to support the ag non-point strategy. We're still, continually doing monitoring that will help us understand where do we need to focus implementation. We also need to figure out how are we going to evaluate whether we're making progress in our ag non-point strategy. So the evaluation piece, and we most likely will at some point be revisiting the priority watersheds. Not doing that at the moment, but eventually we will probably get to that. But I want to focus for now on just the ag non-point strategy. So let's talk about stakeholder engagement now. Let's get down into the nuts and bolts. What does that look like? Who am I talking about? First of all, when we say stakeholders, who are we talking about? So we're talking about farmers primarily. That's our highest priority, is working with farmers. They also work very closely through commodity groups and are influenced by commodity groups and other ag advocacy type groups like Farm Bureau, Federation, soybean growers, corn growers, etc. We also want to engage both conservation and agronomy professionals. Agronomy professionals, I'd say, is another really major priority for us because they are very influential in what farmers do, especially row crop farmers. And we want to make sure that they're also involved in participating in this process. We also have a lot of watershed groups, lake associations, farmer-led watershed groups in Wisconsin, and then conservation and environmental organizations. We have quite a few of those that can be fairly influential in Wisconsin, and many of them work directly with farmers and invest in conservation on farmland. So want to make sure we engage those folks. And then there are also a lot of state and local agency staff who work directly with farmers and getting practices on ag land. We basically had two main approaches to getting stakeholder input: interviews and listening sessions, and our stakeholder roundtable, which I'll talk about in a minute. So how do we recruit folks for our interviews? We wanted to prioritize farmers, but obviously all those folks that I listed, we went after, but we were highly interested in getting farmers involved. So we started with our existing contacts and networks, people that we knew who knew farmers that we knew, and just started from there. And then with each interview, you say, who else should we be talking to? Who is influential in this intersection of conservation and agriculture? So at the end of the day, we were able to involve 128 farmers. Not all of those are one-on-one interviews. I'd say a little over half were like one-on-one small group interviews. The rest were like listening sessions that we held with producer-led watershed groups or other gatherings of farmers. We talked to 26 representatives from the ag industry who were not necessarily farmers, but are advisors to farmers, and 55 government, university, like extension educators. Again, we were looking for people mostly who work directly with farmers and advise farmers on conservation and agronomy. And then 14 representatives from conservation and environmental organizations. The questions that we asked were universal, same questions to everybody. What's working in terms of getting practices on the ground, reducing nutrient loss from ag land? What's working? What's not working? What could be improved? And then what should be included in a nutrient loss reduction strategy? What would be most helpful to expand what's working? So we did all these interviews, and then we engaged a group of folks, our natural resource educators at UW, University of Wisconsin Extension, and asked them to help us to make sense of all of that data, all the interview notes. And what they came up with was they identified 5 overarching themes from those interviews. The first is the importance of peer networks and local partnerships, especially our producer-led watershed groups in Wisconsin, are seen as a really critical vehicle for working with farmers. Also, farmers appreciated their county land and water departments. Those are people who are on the ground and local, who will come out to the farm and talk with them. So they're critical advisors. Trust and communication was another overarching theme. They identified, there's a lack of trust in state agencies, especially DNR. We are the regulatory agency in terms of agriculture. And so, had kind of a rough relationship over the years. And that's partly what we're trying to repair here. But there is a desire for improving those relationships. When we went out to the farms and started talking to the farmers, they were very appreciative that someone from DNR was coming out to their farm and talking to them and listening to them and not telling them what they were doing wrong or looking around for problems, right? We were there to say, what's working for you? How are we not helping? Right? So there's definitely a desire to improve. Economic opportunities and funding, focusing mostly on cost share. Everyone agrees it's critical, it's helpful, but not everyone seems to have equal access to it. And a lot of people, I'm sure many of you have heard, there's complaints about how hard it is to get to it. And there's not a lot of flexibility in how you use it. So a lot of concerns about cost share programs. And then technology and research, a lot of appreciation for on-farm research that happens and involving farmers in that research. There was also recognition that there is a lot of good technology out there that could improve nutrient management, but a lot of it requires a very high initial investment. So how can we get more of that equipment in the hands of folks who can use it? And then in terms of the regulatory and rules, consistency and accountability are both really important. They sense a lot of inconsistencies in how regulations are enforced in local agencies versus, say, state agencies. And we heard a lot about nutrient management plans, both pro and con, but nutrient management plans are kind of a big deal in Wisconsin. And yeah, so we heard a lot of like, this is what's working, this not so much. So I want to talk about our roundtable. So after we did all the interviews and we collated all the information, came up with our themes, we wanted to bring together all the folks that we interviewed, plus some additional representatives of those ag organizations, conservation organizations, county land and water departments, university folks, bring them all together to look at that data and help us make sense of it. We wanted to have them help us prioritize the actions and strategies that we identified out of the what's working, what's not working. Like, what should we be prioritizing for the strategy? And also, of course, part of the reason for bringing all these people together and listening to them and having them help us prioritize what the strategy is going to look like, it's partly about building trust, largely about building a sense of shared purpose and ownership because, oh, I was part of putting that strategy together. I understand how it came together and I understand why it's focusing on the things that it's focusing on. A little bit about how we got people to the table at the big round table. We obviously sent out invites to all the folks that we interviewed. We also opened up 2 spots for any producer-led watershed group leadership. So any group could send 2 people. So that could be up to 100. We have 50 producer-led groups in Wisconsin right now. So 100 invitations went out for the producer-led groups. We also invited the ag commodity groups to send 2 representatives to the table, and then the conservation and environmental organizations as well. So what did we get? We got 140 people who came to the meeting. About a third of those, maybe a little more, were actual farmers, identified themselves as I'm here primarily as a farmer, representing myself. We had 11 representatives 11 groups were represented, sometimes by more than one person, but we had 11 ag advocacy commodity groups like Farm Bureau Federation, Farmers Union, corn growers, soybean growers, etc. 7 conservation and environmental organizations were represented, and then 13 of the producer-led groups sent leaders to the meeting. Our agenda, basically what we were doing was we were taking what we heard from our interviewees. We shared the flash talks about each of the themes. Like, here's what we heard, what's working, what's not working. Then we put together a farmer panel from there's a picture of our farmer panel from the previous slide. 5 farmers representing different commodities. We had some corn and soybean growers. We had dairy. We had a small grazier and a vegetable grower. So kind of representative of the diversity of agriculture in Wisconsin. And they commented on what they heard out of the briefs and talked about, what's ahead of us today, and here's why you should be engaged in this conversation. This is really important. This is a rare opportunity for us farmers to have a say in what the strategy looks like. So kind of a pep talk, right? Leading into the breakout sessions where we talked about the themes and the actions and strategies and worked our way towards prioritizing the actions and strategies that were, so each of the themes then reported back out to the rest of the group. And we talked about, okay, now what are we going to do with all this information? So just to give you a sense, the theme briefs were provided in advance of the meeting, so folks had a chance, if they wanted to look them over, 1 page each, so 5 pages total, 1 page for each theme that talked about kind of the background of what we heard, what's working, what are the challenges, and then so what's working, what's not working, and then we had questions that were kind of guiding the conversation in the breakout groups. So for example, some questions that we asked were, what would you do to maximize participation in cost share programs? Like, what works for you? What would you do? And then also focusing more on the agents, like what could the agencies do to ensure that the short-term investments in conservation lead to long-term. So it was partly what could be done with the farmers and their advisors, what can they do, but also what can we agencies do to help expand what's working and address what's not working. This is just an example of one of the themes, and these are the priority strategies and actions. To be honest, when we look at them at the end of the day, the strategies and actions are a little mixed together, which is kind of common for this sort of activity. The point was we want you to think both short term, what could we do now, almost immediately, what could be done differently or better, and then looking in the long term, what could we do? So the strategies are more like long-term actions, and then the priority actions are what could we do now, almost immediately. So there were 5 of these tables, one for each of the themes. Okay. So looking across all of the themes, what were some of the recurring things that we heard from all the folks on December 9th at the roundtable? They wanted more support for the producer-led groups. It's, again, a great vehicle for getting information out to farmers, for them to talk to each other, learn from each other. It's a safe environment to experiment. So more support for producer-led groups. They wanted agencies to really focus on improving their relationships with the farmers. And they also pointed out things that farmers could do to improve their relationships with agencies. They wanted more consistency from agency leadership in terms of what are we all trying to do together? Like, what are the highest priorities? What should we be focusing on at the local level or at the farm level so that we all feel like we're, working together? This is the, going back to the notion of a shared vision for a strategy. That's what you want to hear. We want consistent messaging. They wanted more transparency. They know that there's a lot of data out there. Like, are we doing a good job at reducing nutrient loss from our farms? We know you have data, but we don't have easy access to it. We don't know how to read that data, or, we just don't know how you gather it or how you're using it. And also, could you help us to gather data from our farms so that we can make better decisions? They asked us to increase access to and flexibility to the cost share programs, as I mentioned earlier. Lowering barriers to new technology, like, for example, having equipment rental programs is a way for somebody to be able to utilize new equipment without having to invest in it. And increasing access to research and research results. They know there's a lot of good research going on out there. They just want more access to it. They want to learn from it. We also did an evaluation at the end of the roundtable, and we really had 2 big things that we wanted people to walk away from this event. One was, at the end of the day, do I feel like this was a good use of my time? So we pretty much asked them that. Was this a good use of your time? And is this moving in a positive direction? And yes, they generally agreed. And are people walking away feeling optimistic about where this is all going? Is this moving in a positive direction? And yeah, it seems like people came away with a pretty positive feeling about where this is going. So we also gave them an opportunity to share their thoughts with us, an open-ended question. So some of the things we heard were, getting this diverse group of folks together in the same room is a good start. Okay? We heard a lot about the diversity of the group. Like, wow, you really got a lot of heavy hitters from a lot of different sectors together in one place at one time. That's pretty awesome. And so another person pointed to, we hear a lot about the science, but we don't always hear about, how are we actually going to work together as human beings and as organizations to make this happen? So that was a positive reaction. But also there's the question of, okay, now what do we do? You've brought all these people together. We've identified some priorities, but how do we make this happen? So there were also a lot of questions about, how do we go from here? Where do we go from here? So quickly, some lessons learned from this whole process so far. We found that asking folks what's working is a great way to start the conversation. If you're familiar with appreciative inquiry, I really am a big believer in starting with an appreciative inquiry, like what's working for you? What do you see that's positive? It gets people in a positive mood. And just to me, it starts the conversation off right. And it's a lot easier to do more of what's working, right, than to start from scratch and try to do something that nobody is doing. We went out to meet with farmers and to meet with other folks, at the counties. We would go to their offices. We put on a lot of miles and got a lot of rides around farms, on UTVs and in pickup trucks. They wanted to show us what they're doing. They were really proud of what they were doing. And I think, again, it was a great way to say that, hey, we are coming to you. We are asking you, reaching out to you. I think that built a lot of social capital. We were focusing on the conservation opinion leaders, the folks who are, when they speak, people listen. I think of them as the nodes of the social network. Like they have a lot of connections. They're involved in a lot of leadership positions. And so, because if you get them on board and they're like, this is something we all need to get on board with and we need to do this, then you're a lot further along than you would otherwise be. And we also reached out to the commodity groups very early on to let them know what our process was, to ask them to help us to get folks to the table, help us find folks to interview. And they got on board and they were very helpful. And again, building social capital. But we also recognize that a lot of what we're doing, because it's so externally focused, our internal folks, we're not used to this kind of process. And they're like, wait, when are we going to work on a strategy? When are you going to ask me for some data? When are we going to do some modeling? So we learned kind of the hard way that we need to let them know that that stuff's going to happen eventually, but that's not where we're starting. And so, yeah, we had to repeat many times, we're focusing on stakeholders first. So what happens next? We're taking all those priority actions and strategies, and we're working with our interagency work group to prioritize those further to say, this is what we collectively are going to work on. And these are the things that we're already doing that we can do more of. These are the things that we will maybe need more resources to do. So that's the process we're entering in right now. And we're also working on the other elements of the strategy that I mentioned before. So all that work needs to happen in the next 10 months or so. And if you want to learn more, this is our landing page for our strategy. You might want to get the language very exact, because otherwise you'll probably be taken to the DNR's nutrient loss reduction strategy page, which is old. And we're trying to shift things to this neutral page that isn't branded with DNR to reflect the fact that this is a collective, collaborative effort and doesn't belong just to DNR. That's what I had to share.
Well, thank you for that presentation. We do have a couple of questions that came in. See, the first one, can you name some of the practices, metrics, or systems that people reported as working for them?
Yeah, it depended a lot on the commodity. Like if you know Wisconsin agriculture, you know that we have pretty diverse array of different kinds of commodities that we grow. So like potato and vegetable growers, we're probably more focused on groundwater and nitrates and things that they can do to try to reduce the leaching of nitrogen into groundwater. With our dairy producers, big dairy producers, they're very focused on manure management. And one of the things that was brought up was low impact injection equipment. So being able to inject it so that you're not just applying it to the surface, but also not disturbing the ground. So that's a big focus for a lot of the dairy industry. Cover crops were, probably not surprising, talked about by a lot of farmers as, we've got to get more cover crops on the ground. So those are some of the ones that come to mind.
Do you have any thoughts on how we maintain consistency in messaging?
Well, we're going to try to find out. So, one of the things that we are investing some of our Gulf hypoxia program funding in is in communication and marketing, a marketing strategy in the sense of how are we going to market the things that we agree these are the changes that we are trying to promote. Like these are the practices we're trying to promote or the systems that we're trying to promote. And so that is going to be part of what our interagency work group is talking about with stakeholders. That's going to be critical, is to be asking stakeholders, like, does this message resonate with you? And also, I think when the agency representatives go back to their individual agencies, they need to have conversations with their leadership to say, look, here's what we collectively, as an interagency work group, identified as our highest priorities, highest priority messages, outcomes, objectives, et cetera. What do we need to do internally to get in line with that? Whether that's about messaging or whether that's about our programs and what kinds of things we're funding. It's an iterative process, right? You got to continually go back and forth with stakeholders, with the interagency work group, back to your agencies. But that is going to be a high priority for us, is identifying what are those common messages that we all want to say, we are all on board with this. And, this message is coming from all of us.
How will you be communicating with the stakeholders to let them know what's happening as you move through this process?
Yeah, so we asked folks when they registered for the roundtable to provide their email if they were interested in staying abreast of information. So we've got that. We got that list of email. We just talked today about maybe having, every 2 weeks, we're going to send out an update to everybody who's interested in, staying abreast of what's happening with the strategy. So that's one answer to that question, is we actually have a consultant who's going to work with us to actually produce the messages that are going to go out, but we're going to try to do that on a very regular basis. So they're all the participants in the December 9th meeting. We'll also work with the commodity groups. We'll work through the county land and water offices. Now we've got lots of connections, folks who know what we're doing, understand the mission and the purpose, who we can count on to, like, if we provide them with regular updates, they're going to send that out to their members and their networks. So, yeah, that's going to be a really important aspect of going forward. We want people to feel like they didn't just come together, give us a bunch of information, and then not hear from us again until like the end of the calendar year when we produce a strategy. We want them to feel like, they're at the very least staying informed and up to date all the way through the process. Great question.
Could you provide a little more detail on how the farmers you interviewed were chosen, and how did you reach out to them? What information did you provide at the beginning of that process?
Yeah. So, like I said, for me, I was with Extension for several years before I started working for DNR. So I had a lot of connections through my previous employment, and I would reach out to oftentimes county land and water offices in other states. It would be soil and water districts, and ask them, who are the farmers who work with you, who are influential, who are really engaged in the conversation around conservation? Also, certain boards, like we have, some of our university Discovery Farms has a board of directors that are all farmers. And so that was kind of a good audience to go to. And then once you talk to somebody and you ask them, who else should we be talking to? I mean, you end up with way more people than you can ever talk to. So just using that snowball methodology helped a lot. And then in terms of how did we communicate with them, if we didn't know the person directly, we went through the person who was recommending them. And so we would say, could you send them an email and let them know that I'm going to be contacting them and this is why? And, if you want to add a little encouragement, like, I think this is a great opportunity. I think you should take them up on this. that's also very helpful. So utilizing those networks, getting people to open the door for you.
Right. And at this point in the process, for maybe other states that might do something similar, do you have any words of advice, maybe pitfalls to avoid or things you wish you may have maybe approached a little differently?
Um, yeah, we certainly, had some stumbles along the way, but I feel like as long as you are being sincere in we are interested in learning from you, and if you're willing to go out and meet them where they're at, you kind of can't go wrong. I definitely would encourage you to be looking for the influencers, the farmers who are not necessarily on the cutting edge of conservation, but who are well respected, who've maybe been recognized as being leaders in conservation. And starting with them, you can also work through your commodity groups again, asking them who are the leaders in conservation in this area or that area or this commodity or that commodity, and use your networks to reach out to them and be very sincere about, I want to know what you see that's working, what's working for you. I want to know what your ideas are. I found that the farmers that I talked to were just extremely generous with their time and very pleased to have someone from DNR reaching out to them and saying, I want to hear from you and I'm willing to come to your farm and see what you're up to. So I, obviously we didn't just talk to farmers, we reached out to other organizations, but generally like the conservation environmental organizations, they're going to be eager to talk to you. There's not really that much work you have to do to sit down with them and talk, but farmers are much more cautious. So be respectful of their time, be respectful of the work that they're doing, and show appreciation would be my advice.
And did you provide a stipend to farmers for participating at any point in the process?
Our 5 farmers that were part of our kind of panelists, we provided them with travel money, and I don't remember if it went above that. I think we definitely covered their travel expenses, but that was pretty much it. Most of the other farmers that we talked to, we went to them. So, or we, in some cases, did online interviews, but for the most part, we drove to see them. So, and they seemed anxious and eager and more than happy to talk to us. So, I guess that's another thing I would add. You got to be conscious of when you're reaching out to farmers, what are the times of year for different commodities? It's different. When's a good time of year to talk to a dairyman? Uh, that's kind of tough. It's probably more time of day. Make sure you're not there in milking time. But yeah, so it's really just being flexible and being accommodating.
All right, well, it looks like we've gotten through all of the questions. I want to thank you again for your presentation. Oh, thanks. So our next seminar is on March 11th. We'll have Matt Druitz with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency talking about their 2025 nutrient reduction strategy updates and next steps. Do you have any final words you'd like to pass along?
If anybody has any questions about what we're doing or would like to talk more about what we're doing or hear more, I'm more than happy to have individual conversations. Please feel free to reach out to me. Love to share what we're doing and learn from what all of you folks are doing too, because we're treading on new ground. So do not claim to be experts in this. We're kind of fumbling around in the dark too. So if you have ideas about how we can maybe avoid some pitfalls or do a better job of what we're doing, also happy to hear that. But please do feel free to reach out to me.
So I'm going to stop recording